Hello, today is Friday, September 26th, and welcome to episode 506 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Morgan Vina, and I'm joined today by Senior Fellows Jeffrey Wells and Andy Kaiser, as well as our Junior Fellow, Jessica Jones. This week was a busy one for President Trump on the international stage. First, he was in New York speaking at the UN General Assembly, meeting with a bevy of foreign leaders. And yesterday, he came back to Washington and met with Turkish President Erdoğan. F-35 fighter jets were on the top of the agenda. As you may recall, Turkey was expelled from the United States' F-35 fighter jet program during President Trump's first term after Ankara purchased Russia's S-400 air defense system, a move that the administration posed a security risk to F-35 technology. Since then, Ankara has lobbied for reinstatement and resumption of the program, while Washington has drawn a hard line and maintained its restrictions. While the tone of the meeting was more conciliatory than we've seen in recent years, there were no firm public commitments made about reinstating Turkey into the F-35 program or fully lifting CASA sanctions. So Turkey, despite being a NATO ally, is a bit of a wild card when it comes to supporting a Western pro-liberal agenda. And I mean liberal in the classical individual liberty and whatnot sense. Erdoğan has become quite the autocrat throughout his extended tenure in office, and he's cracked down heavily on internal dissent. Also, Erdoğan has become way too comfortable and way too frenzy with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And he actually delayed Finland's membership. Turkey's hatred of Israel is also out in the open for everyone to see, and has even given safe haven to Hamas, which I may remind our audience is a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization. So, what to make of this? Jeffrey, let's start with you. I gave an introduction and just gave a rather skeptical summary of Turkey as a U.S. NATO partner and ally. Tell me, is this fair? And how would you rate Erdoğan in terms of his sincerity when it comes to rebuilding a positive relationship with Washington?
Morgan, your skepticism is fair here. And this is much like the real leaders of NATO reality show that Andy Cohen's working on. Turkey certainly is a NATO ally, although it's not always been a predictable partner. And some may argue, what does it even mean to be a NATO ally at the moment? And so, their purchasing of Russian S-400s was a deliberate choice, and they paid for that price back in 2019. But this is 2025; things are much different. As for Erdoğan's sincerity, he's pragmatic. He's certainly not sentimental, and his compass is always pointing towards his survival, both at home and how to leverage that abroad. And when it comes to helping him domestically, he always leans, certainly has leaned towards Moscow over the last 6-7 years. When he needs economic relief or high-end defense tech, he pivots towards Washington and Europe. And right now, he's talking about rapprochement, but without concrete steps. It's a bit of theater. And so I think being skeptical, yes, until Turkey proves it's willing to make sacrifices, especially around the S-400. I think we see these handshakes as a grain of salt. The catch though here is while U.S. law prevents the sale or at least of these first 6 and even more thereafter, is that President Trump could just wave a pen or post something on True Social to make it happen, and Congress and the U.S. government might go along with that. So this is kind of a Schrodinger's alliance, so to speak. That Turkey's either in and they're out of the alliance until proven otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So, Andy, Erdoğan wants to have his cake and eat it too here, right? Any re-entry of Turkey into the F-35 program would require a lot of work. This isn't just the sale of planes. It's the rebuilding of Turkey's defense industrial base around this specific program. Detailed inspections, security assurances, and the disabling of the S-400 to prevent intel leaks would be required. Do you think Turkey is up to the task? Do you think Erdogan's going to budge on the S-400?
I do think that's a key linchpin. When we have the Russians' no limits relationship with the Chinese, for example, we can't risk jeopardizing that technology of the F-35 from getting into our adversaries' hands. It took years and decades to develop this airplane, which is might be over budget and behind schedule also. But it's an important consideration. Turkey is a tricky, a sticky wicket for sure, a tricky ally. In addition to NATO membership, of course, we also maintain 50 nuclear weapons in Incirlik as a deterrent against the Russians, which is, of course, an interesting item to note. Part of me likes the idea that the Turks would be bound to U.S. defense industrial base for decades if they do enter this F-35 program. It's not just the airplanes themselves, as you mentioned, Morgan. It's the parts and the components and the maintenance that would sort of further bind the Turks. Erdogan also was instrumental in Syria in pushing out the Russians' ally in Assad. So it's a very complicated relationship in a very complicated region, and there's no easy answers, unfortunately, Morgan.
Yeah, Andy, I think that's an important point that you made about Incirlik, and that is, the United States has an air base there. We have U.S. military personnel and civilians, and we do have a longstanding relationship of, a military presence in Turkey. So that is, I am sure, will come into the equation as well. Jess, Erdogan wants something from us. What do we want from Turkey? What is our leverage here?
That's great. It's when I was thinking about Erdogan's visit with President Trump, you see kind of the playbook that President Trump wields, which is like a little bit of praise and then a little bit of pressure, right? You see, you called it a conciliatory meeting. I think it was much friendlier and warmer than that. President Trump did heap some large amounts of praise on Erdogan, even making the joke that they've been friends for years. I think that was the comment about the rigged elections, literally, is said in him, like looking back all these years on their friendship. And at the same time, then he starts to put the pressure on, right, cutting off, pressure for Turkey to cut off their purchase of Russian energy, which we've talked about here on the show. He's done the same with India and Modi. Turkey, compared to India and China, Turkey purchases less energy than the two, but it's an important pipeline for Turkey itself. Obviously, talked about the S-400s. But when we see this playbook, I question whether the praise and then pressure has actually come up with that many wins recently. When we think of Putin or when we think of President Trump in his first administration with Kim Jong-un, it's hard to see the credible wins that come out of that. And one wonders, even if Turkey were to cut off its purchase of Russian energy, what that would really do to Moscow's calculus when it comes to Ukraine, if they're not quite as important of a purchaser as India and China. And into the same point that Jeffrey and Andy were talking about, at this, this weird paradox of Turkey and NATO, at the same time that they're purchasing Russian energy and we're coming down hard on them, and that they're also sending, anti-drone aircraft to Lithuania for to help protect the airspace, considering that Russian drones have been violating it. So both, this cornerstone of the alliance and a good show of solidarity and sending support to Lithuania, but yet let's see if there's any concrete steps when it comes to actually cutting off its, making some changes to its relationship with Russia.
Yeah. So, I'll end here by saying, while I'm not a fan of rewarding bad behavior, and Turkey certainly has been quite naughty, I think there is an opportunity for President Trump to get something out of this dialogue with Erdogan. But at the end of the day, Turkey has to play by the rules, right? And so, my negotiation terms that the White House should take on: 1, get rid of the S-400. Turkey has to get rid of the S-400. That is non-negotiable.
Jeffrey's taking notes.
Yeah, Jeffrey. They need to end rhetorical and, more importantly, material support for Hamas. They need to establish a deconfliction mechanism with Israel over Syria. And then lastly, Turkey needs to stop messing about in Greek and Cypriot airspace and stop. They just need to respect their territorial boundaries, period. And so with that, it's a wrap. Thanks always to Kelly Crowley, Taylor Lee, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us on Monday, September 29th, our last episode before the U.S. government shut down. So you'll have to join us on Wednesday for the aftermath on another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart, fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Y'all, you know this, we are on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.